First, it was Shane Getson, the MLA for Lac St. Anne Parkland. And then last week, it was Roger Reid, the UCP MLA for Livingston McLeod, both of them claiming that the fourth wave is really the fault of the Alberta Health Services for not planning enough ICU beds. And that's why Alberta is in the horrible COVID-19 pandemic crisis that it is. Well, this is just ridiculous. That narrative is completely unmoored from the evidence, but nevertheless, something's going on here. And I want to talk to Professor Duane Bratt, political scientist from Mount Royal University, about it. So welcome to the interview, Duane.
Good afternoon, Markham.
So look, the way this looks to me, this looks like one of those American-style culture war narratives where you're in political trouble, so you float this narrative that you don't care if it's true or if there's any evidence for it or if it's completely, utterly false. But the thing is, you want to give talking points to your supporters, and so here are the good foot soldiers, Getson and Reid, doing that. Is that a fair take on this?
Well, when I originally heard Getson's piece, it was right after the special caucus meeting to debate the future of Jason Kenney, and I thought maybe this was one of the talking points that came up in that debate, and he's just laying this out. But then you see another MLA doing the same thing. You go, okay, well, clearly that was a talking point. But then it gets broader and broader, and it becomes a major point that a number of people are reaching. Now, the question is, was this coordinated? Was this leaked out? Was this suggested? It's either that or a handful of individuals all coming to the same conclusion at the same time. And what makes that unlikely is just how untrue it is. They are blaming Alberta Health Services for not preparing for the fourth wave when the government of Alberta told them in June there would be no fourth wave, right? So what is AHS supposed to do? It also goes back to prior to COVID, with this idea that Alberta should have 1,000 ICU beds, fully staffed, fully equipped, just in case, with 70 or 80 patients, but they need 1,000 beds. What sort of government, particularly a fiscally conservative government, would think that would be a good use of dollars? So it is looking to blame someone else, and I think there's some racial misogynist overtones on this criticism of Alberta Health Services as well. And the last point on this is, this is actually one of the reasons Alberta Health Services was created in the first place, was to create this arm's length group away from the government that could deflect heat or grab heat from the government, because they're able to say, well, it's not us, it's Alberta Health Services, which is fully funded by the Alberta government.
Right, and what strikes me about this is the egregiousness of the well, we'll call them lies, because
they are lies, and they confront exactly the statements made by the Premier and the Health Minister only months before. If there is no fourth wave, how can you then blame the Alberta Health Services for not planning for a fourth wave, unless they're saying you should have known better than what we were telling you? So they are lies.
Well, and my normal beat is energy and climate. So as you can imagine, I've been following Jason Kenney's and his comments since 2018, the last 3-4 years, and then through the election, where narrative played a big role in the victory of the UCP, and I've noticed this same approach to narrative, political narrative, and I'm just kind of shocked because it's so outrageous. And the question is, it worked in 2019 because the conditions were right. Can it still work in 2021 in the face of all this evidence?
No.
Is it an effective?
No, this can't work. And it shows just a sign of desperation. We've seen repeated polls that are showing the Kenney government's approval rating around COVID between 9 and 22%. So roughly someplace in the teens, which is as low as Brian Mulroney before he resigned after the GST, as low as Alison Redford before she resigned. So I don't think it's going to work, but we have seen this sort of criticism before, that it's not us, it's the health system that is at fault here. And Kenny even mentioned this months ago when he was comparing the record to Texas, and pointed out, that that's not a fair comparison. Texas has a private healthcare system, so it has a lot more ICU beds. At the time when I heard that, it's almost like he wished Alberta had a private health system so that we would be in competition and hospitals would put more people into intensive care, whether they needed to or not, because that's where the money is to be made. But I don't think that's the strategy here. I think the strategy is, it's not our fault. It's got to be somebody else's fault. And it's Alberta Health Services for not properly preparing for this fourth wave that we told them was never going to come.
There's another theme that kind of fits in here, Duane, and I've interviewed a number of experts now who talk about how bad the UCP are at government, especially in handling this COVID pandemic. And yeah. Dr. Lorian Hardcastle from the University of Calgary made the point, just as an example, that every decision the government makes is made at the last minute. It's whatever solution they come up with is not a very good solution. And the bureaucracy, the Alberta Health Services or Dr. Dina Henshaw's shop, are then scrambling to write health policy and public health orders, and they're poorly done because they're not given any time by the government. And this is
and I think I would agree with that. One of the good illustrations of this has been the COVID passport card. So first they announce a passport, but they don't call it a passport. So they've got to come up with some other ridiculous name, the restrictions exemption program. Then they come up with a card, a week later, and then realize people can edit that card. So then it takes another week and they come up with a QR code, but then they discover that that's not actually scannable. And so in policy studies, we teach our students scenario planning. Prepare for this. You may never have to use it, but you want something to be able to pull off the shelf. So the question here is this incompetence that they simply aren't delivering on basic structures of government, or is this malice? In other words, were the bureaucracy specifically told, do not scenario plan, do not start to work on a passport? And so I think that's still an open debate about why we're not seeing this. Manitoba has a card, laminable, and they've had it for months. BC was able to bring out a QR scannable code pretty quickly. What is going on here in Alberta? So is it malice or is it incompetence? I think that's an open debate.
Well, isn't that a lovely choice of conclusions to come to? Is it malice or is it incompetence? Goodness gracious, that speaks volumes about the government. So,
well, and the reason I say that is so Kenny always acts weeks, months after he should, right? So when he is giving the line about, we'll bring in an incentive program to get people vaccinated, but not a vaccine passport system. And it leaked out that they were actually secretly working on a passport system, even though they may use it. He was probably fearful of that coming out. So the way to do it is just kibosh everything, which meant that when you do eventually do the right thing, you're scrambling behind the scenes. Even the restrictions program, when he came out with that, it created chaos throughout the province. The university that I'm at was debating an emergency session right afterwards, trying to figure out what they were supposed to do. And around 11 o'clock at night, they decided, let's just cancel classes for 2 days. Business groups didn't know whether they could open or not open. It was only like a week later that food court operators and malls were saying, no, you don't even apply for this program. So it's like they're making up policy as they go along. And just expect the rest of the province to figure it out themselves.
Duane, actually, I think I've asked you this question before, but I think in light of what we've talked about today, I'm going to ask it again. Is there precedent in Canadian political history for a provincial government this bad?
So there's an ongoing debate about that. Bill Aberhart in the 1930s was a pretty bad premier. He took power in 1935. He tried to create Alberta's own currency. There was a whole series of legislation that got struck down by the Supreme Court because he was violating jurisdiction. He tried to lock the lieutenant governor out of his home. He tried to bully the Edmonton Journal and the Edmonton Bulletin into producing puff pieces from his government in rebuttal to editorials. So the Aberhart has been sort of the standard of really bad government. And despite it being in the Depression, a lot of what he did got overturned. Much of what he tried to do, he was simply too incompetent to accomplish. And it wasn't during a pandemic, right? So I would put Kenny worse than Aberhart because of the death toll that's accompanying this.
Well, goodness gracious. All the best, Alberta. Thank you very much, Duane. Appreciate your insights as always.
Okay, thanks, Markham.